Hello, I'm Beth Britton. I support Dementia Community with their communications work. Welcome and thank you for joining our second July webinar. Before we get into the topic for today, I wanted to briefly explain a bit more about Dementia Community. Dementia Community is a charitable community benefit society, a membership cooperative that provides learning and networking opportunities for the dementia care community. Dementia Community's core purpose is to connect and empower the dementia care community. Dementia Community's vision is of a world where all people in the dementia care community feel connected, informed, empowered and purposeful, and are actively engaged in co-producing changes that improve everyone's experience of dementia in care and in wider society. To sum up, if you are aware of the work of the National Dementia Action Alliance before it disbanded, we hope that Dementia Community is a replacement for the NDAA. Community members own a £1 community share in Dementia Community, and membership is open to everyone. So if you aren't already a member, do join us. There are both benefits and opportunities to joining us. My colleague Beth Lang has put a link in the chat, and you can also scan the QR code that is on your screen. If you have any difficulties at all with the technical side of becoming a member, do let Beth or myself know, and we'll do our very best to help you. So on to the topic of today's webinar, which is I want to live as normal as possible, meaningful activity in young onset dementia. I will introduce you to our speakers shortly, but just some brief housekeeping first. We are recording this webinar, so if you don't want your face on the recording, please turn your camera off. Please use the chat for your questions. We will have a Q&A and discussion after the presentation, and we will be keeping an eye on the chat for that. We also hope to have some live participation, so if you would like to come off mute during the Q&A and ask your question, please make that known to us, put your hand up, etc. Afterwards, Beth Lang will email you the slides. The recording will also go onto our YouTube channel, Journal of Dementia Care, so do look out for that. We will also send you a feedback form. We'd be really grateful if you could fill that in for us to improve our learning and development. So let's get started then. So our speakers for today, Professor Oyebode, Professor of Dementia Care at the University of Bradford, and Dr. Jacqui Hussey, Consultant Old Age Psychiatrist, Berkshire Healthcare Trust, and a trustee of younger people with dementia. Ladies, just thrilled to have you with us. Thank you so much, and I will hand over to you.
Thank you very much for that introduction. As Jacqui and Beth know, I've arrived by the skin of my teeth because I seem to be in a waiting room in limbo for quite a while, but we're here now. And thank you to everyone for waiting patiently. So Jacqui and I are going to talk about meaningful activity in young onset dementia. It's a topic that we've thought about jointly together fairly recently because we've looked at the evidence around the benefits of meaningful activity and thought through all the examples we could think of meaningful activity, because we've been working jointly together on a book chapter on the area. So we're going to divide this session between us, and I'm going to start off with a little bit about why we feel meaningful activity in young onset dementia and wanting to live as normally as possible is really important to people and valuable, and say a little bit about the research evidence. And then I'm going to hand over to Jacqui, and Jacqui's going to talk about three particular types of activity and the experience with young people with dementia in using those types of activity. So on the next slide, you can just see the outline. Oh, sorry. On the next slide, you can see a quote that we put at the beginning of our presentation because we thought that this would be a really nice introduction about the importance of activity. This is a participant from a big research study on young onset dementia called the Angela Project. And this individual said, "I'm still full of the person who I used to be, who I am. I'm still full of the youngness, full of the energy and enthusiasm. So what's important for me is something that's compatible with who I am." So that, we hope, sums up in a nutshell how important it is for each and every person to have a way of harnessing their energy and enthusiasm and feel that they have something fulfilling to do. So on the next slide, we've just given an outline of what we'll cover in our talk, with a bit more about the context of being a younger person with a diagnosis of dementia that makes activity so important to everyday life. Say a little bit about the evidence base and why that activity is important, and then look at singing, physical activity and shared reading, 3 different types of activity. And then we'll look at the common themes across those activities, which we think get at the essence of why they're so helpful. So to start thinking about meaningful activity for people who are younger and have a diagnosis of dementia. If you receive a diagnosis of dementia in your 50s or early 60s, or even earlier in life than that, you're really at a very busy phase of life. People in their 40s, 50s, 60s are used to rushing around. They're used to feeling lots of demands. A lot of people will be employed. You're used to the activity of a job that gets you up in the morning, takes you out to do something, and gets you home tired at the end of the day. People are used to being physically active. A lot of people with younger onset dementia, as compared with later onset, have typically better physical health. People haven't experienced so much of the wear and tear of aging and haven't picked up as many chronic conditions. So people are used to being physically active. People have a lot of energy. But then, of course, when you have a diagnosis of young onset dementia, the cognitive difficulties you might have, the behavioural issues you might have, can interfere with your middle-aged lifestyle. And that causes a lot of problems, because you can feel, if you have to give up your job and your employment, you can feel more worthless, you can feel at a loose end, you don't know where to put your energy. It can rob you of some of your sense of purpose. In the Netherlands, they carried out a big research study looking at unmet needs for people with young onset dementia, and they found that the lack of having something meaningful to do with your time was one of the most common unmet needs for people. So when we want to promote the importance of an area, and when we want to try and change practice in relation to an area, one thought would be to get reference to it in policy guidance or guidelines for services to follow. And we would want all services and professionals to feel it's an important priority to address meaningful activity. But to get meaningful activity into policy and guidance, we need to be able to draw on the evidence base. And policymakers and researchers value the conventional view of high quality evidence. People really want to see randomized controlled trials that compare outcomes for people who have an opportunity for meaningful activity with outcomes for people who don't, because they want to see what value is added and to know that this is a worthwhile way for health and social care professionals to spend their time and their limited resources before encouraging us all to focus on an area like occupation. So one of the problems for us in this area is that there isn't a lot of conventional high quality evidence, but there is increasing qualitative evidence. So on the next slide, I've mentioned a summary that draws together all the qualitative studies that there were up to a couple of years ago on what people prefer from support services. So this meta-synthesis found 43 qualitative studies, and they analysed them all and compared their findings, and they found that one of the 6 themes that was important to both people living with young onset dementia and family supporters was that people should have the skills to reduce social isolation and meaningfully engage in social support. And people with young onset dementia had one or two themes in their responses that weren't found among family supporters. And one of the two themes that were unique for people with young onset dementia was that people wanted support to identify and pursue opportunities to engage in rewarding or positive activities. So we can see that from qualitative studies which consult people with young onset generally, that it's very important to people with young onset dementia to have that opportunity to have something to do that's satisfying and engaging. On the right hand of this slide, you can see a little diagram here saying underneath keeping engaged. This is from a study, again from the Netherlands, by Van Vliet and colleagues. And they looked at the sort of activities that people pursued over time. And if you view that oblong as a journey through dementia, the trajectory of dementia, you can see earlier on what was most important to people was that they could retain their own sense of contributing, a sense of usefulness. Later on, the use of activity for leisure and enjoyment became more important, but all the way through, occupation was important. So the next slide is about the findings of the Angela project. This was a large study carried out in the UK, led by Janet Carter from UCL. And at the university where I work, we led the work stream on post-diagnostic support. And throughout the project, we tried to focus on the positives to try and find a bit of a solution-focused approach. So we asked people if they had received services that were helpful. And if they'd received services that were helpful, we asked who they were helpful for, why were they helpful, and who was involved. And from that process, we got almost 900 examples from people living with young onset and family supporters of helpful services. And we carried out 24 in-depth interviews as well to drill down and find out more about it. And from analysis of all these examples, we felt that helpful services met usually one of three needs. They met the need for people to feel empowered and in control of their lives, the need for people to be themselves or maintain their identity, and the need for people to feel fully connected with others in their family, their neighbourhood, and the community. So on the next slide is an example of how activity can help someone to be empowered and to retain their own identity. And this is an example from one of our respondents, a 55-year-old man who wrote, "When I retired at the age of 47, I started making furniture. I've got a lovely workshop in the garden with all these lovely woodworking tools that I'm not allowed to go into and use unless supervised. So now I have a buddy who helps me decide the things we can do. It works very well with him. It's just like having a more able version of myself. I have a project in my head, I develop a master plan, and we go out walking and collecting bits of wood. It's great because it enables me to have my own space and time to do things that are important for me." So you can feel here this unique individual who has this particular interest and talent for making furniture that he can no longer pursue in the way he did, but he's been able to use probably a personal independence payment to pay for him to have a buddy that he can work with a few hours a week. And he feels that's a more able version of himself, and it makes a huge difference. And on the next slide is an example around activity to help people feel connected. And in this example, someone says, the support group for South Asian people with young onset dementia and carers, delivered by a South Asian facilitator, was very good for us as a family because of the discussions we had. We were nearly 25 people, had a cup of tea, shared experiences with each other, and that encouraged you to be brave and be prepared because you weren't alone. So here's an example of an activity that's not so much a hobby or a particular pastime, but it's an opportunity for people to get together. And by sharing that sense of peer support, these individuals who might have otherwise felt the stigma and tried to hide away from voicing that there was dementia affecting someone younger in the family, felt able to connect, talk to each other, and no longer felt isolated. So on the next slide, we've put a little bit of information about possible long-term benefits. So we can see from these qualitative studies how people gain pleasure and enjoyment and a sense of fulfillment from taking part in meaningful activity and just having that sense of being a normal person in a normal world. But in long term, we think that activities may lead to reduction in depression, a reduction of crises arising. Maybe they reduce problematic behaviour because a person doesn't feel frustrated or restless or bored and apathetic so much. And they may lead to a reduction in antipsychotics. The evidence isn't very strong at present, but on the right, we've put in a graph. This graph shows in the community interest organisation where Jacqui works, the number of young people served by the organisation who are prescribed antipsychotics, and it's only just over 4%. And if you look at a more general population, and the most equivalent sample we could find was a Dutch one. So of course there are caveats here, but you can see that in that group, the prescriptions of antipsychotics were over 17%. So in terms of trying to provide evidence for commissioners of services that having something active and meaningful to do is worthwhile, it would be great if we could expand further the evidence base on long-term benefits. So on the next slide, we've shown some categories of meaningful activities. The ones in the, what colour would you call it? The colour that's not purple. Is it magenta? Gardening, shared reading, cooking, volunteering and reminiscence. Those areas have rather more formal evidence than the others, but the others also have a degree of qualitative and anecdotal evidence. And there are all sorts of things there that people choose to do and that people could be given opportunities to do to replace the levels of activity and work engagement and other commitments that people would have had before dementia interfered with them. So on the next slide, you can see some pictures representing our specific examples. And I'm going to hand over to Jacqui, who's going to talk about these examples and experiences of using them in YPWD. So over to Jacqui.
Thank you, Jan. So I'm going to talk about these kind of specific examples of activities, really for people living with young onset dementia. Importantly, to kind of get people thinking about how you might be able to deliver these and what adaptations might be required. And I am, as Jan says, going to specifically give kind of my experience and examples from the Younger People with Dementia charity, which operates in Berkshire and parts of Surrey. So the charity's been running since 2012, and it's sort of grown and grown, really, mainly because we're trying to collect evidence as we go. But it's about the whole premise of the charity is to offer activities for people living with a diagnosis of young onset dementia, and making sure that those activities are meaningful for them, because that's how you really get people to engage. So if we move on to the next slide, how I'm going to try and deliver this to you is to kind of give you what the research is. And as Jan says, the research is kind of limited, and we do rely much more on sort of the qualitative type research. But there is evidence to show that group singing can improve health and well-being. And we know that in particular, choral singing, so singing together in groups, can improve attention skills in people living with Alzheimer's disease. And the particular study by Bannon and Montgomery Smith was really the launch pad for Singing for the Brain, which obviously is kind of widespread across the country, but in the main is targeted more just because of the age profile for older people living with dementia. And the feedback that we've had, I'm a jobbing clinician, is that yes, that's fine, but if you're a younger person, then you want to be singing songs from your era rather than maybe some of the older kind of 1950s songs. There's also other research evidence, so a study by Clift is that choirs can have a positive impact on not just cognition, but also mood, attention. And by singing collectively, that provides social support. So if we move on to the next slide, this is to just really think about how singing and choirs can be specifically adapted for younger people living with dementia. And this has been the experience of what the YPWD charity provides in Berkshire. In fact, there are now 2 choirs, one also in Surrey. The choir that we have in Berkshire has about 30 to 35 attendees. And if you were thinking of designing something, then you might think, well, what have people got in common? Well, the only thing that they have in common is younger age at the time of diagnosis. So the choir can actually accommodate people with a whole range of diagnoses. So Alzheimer's disease, frontotemporal dementia, usually a group which kind of having access to group activities is often quite limited by the very nature of perhaps people's behavioural presentations. But certainly the choirs in Berkshire and Surrey accommodate people living with Lewy body dementia, posterior cortical atrophy, a whole range. And the format is very familiar and it provides routines. So people are going for choir practice. So there's a choir leader who provides kind of visual cues and prompts. And this can help if people are struggling with comprehension of language, then there's a lot of use of visual cues as well. And really, really importantly, in terms of engagement and making the activity meaningful, is that the songs are age appropriate for the individuals with young onset dementia. So that can be your ABBA, Rod Stewart's, you name it, really. But it's the songs that we would be singing, have been singing in, if you're a 50-year-old, what you might have been singing in your teens and 20s. And I think the other really important thing about the setup of the choir is that it's in a non-clinical setting. So this is really important, and it felt really important for us that it was in a community setting. Basically, it's a dementia-free environment in a sense. And this has had a really important kind of extra, well, a bonus really, is that it's reduced stigma and it's really got the community involved and interested in what's going on. So our Berkshire group meets in a kind of arts centre in the middle of Reading. Lots of other activities are going on there, but the staff actually say it's the highlight of their week when the choir goes and does their practice there. So if we can have the next slide. So these have been, as Jan says, we haven't got hard research, but these have been the observations, and the choir has been running now for over 10 years. And, it's the same. So we see new cohorts of people starting, but these are the same observations. Certainly the choir provides a sense of belonging. So people have identity through the choir. I'm going to my choir practice. And through seeing, the same people, it provides that sense of friendship and also, really importantly, a sense of normalcy. it's cognitively challenging at times, and I certainly pop into choir from time to time, and they're learning new, fairly complex songs, and the choir in Reading is called Harmony, and they do just that, they sing in harmony. So there are quite a few cognitive challenges. For some people, they're learning new songs. There's the whole complexity around the kind of rhythm, the timing of songs, when to come in with your part. But as mentioned, there's a familiar format to it. So people arrive, there's a meet and greet, cup of tea, warm-up exercises. So people see the predictability of it each week. And through having that weekly routine, that certainly helps with people's orientation. And what we see is that people can interact in ways that I don't see in clinic. And actually, I often go, when I know that I've got a few people to review, rather than bring them up to clinic and asking them lots of questions which highlight and try to find their disabilities, I just go along to choir and observe, chat with them at the end. But actually, through seeing people in the choir, people that have perhaps quite challenging communication difficulties, I can see them singing purposefully, singing throughout, making connections with other people. So it kind of cuts across, particularly where people have got other types of impairments. And the really, really important thing, coming back to the theme of this talk, is that it's meaningful for people. So it's not just come along to this activity, actually come along to choir practice because we're rehearsing for the Christmas concert, or we're rehearsing because we're singing in St. George's Chapel in Windsor. So there's always a task associated with it. And I can honestly say that everyone, even myself, if I'm in a bit of a bad mood, you leave the choir happy. So it's definitely good for elevating mood. If we go on to the next slide. So thinking about other range of activities, physical activity, we know the importance of physical activity, whether you have, someone's living with dementia or not. It's kind of part of healthy lifestyle. So through physical activity, it helps with people's kind of coordination, motor control. It raises your serotonin and levels. Apparently, I do lots of exercise. I've never ever had a high through exercise, but apparently that happens, and people are left with a sense of well-being. And there is, some kind of more limited evidence that actually through exercise, you are increasing the blood flow to the brain, and that might promote cell growth. Thinking about younger people with dementia, so I kind of, Jan and I have reflected on this in the chapter of our book, but actually support services for people with dementia are kind of very much geared up to kind of tasks. Let's go and help people and complete this task, and it's often completing a task for the person rather than alongside. And I think for younger people with dementia, we're kind of missing a trick in terms of what care agencies are providing, because actually supporting someone either through a buddy system or access to groups where people can do activity, which, as we said at the beginning, if you're in your 40s, 50s, early 60s, you kind of expect to be exercising regardless of your diagnosis. But actually, this sort of exercise, the access gets denied. People can't get to places because they've often stopped driving. There are assumptions about people's abilities to still do different types of exercise. So there's a lack of trained people to support younger people living with dementia to continue doing exercises. There's a lot of negative assumptions about risk associated with exercise. If you've got someone that's living with dementia with Lewy bodies, then actually, playing badminton might seem quite risky because there'll be a falls risk. If you've got posterior cortical atrophy, then, well, certainly they wouldn't be able to play badminton because they've got kind of visual perceptual problems. I'm just kind of noticing that in the picture at the bottom of the slide, there is a gentleman with posterior cortical atrophy with a racket in his hand. So it's about kind of challenging those negative assumptions about risk. And, you know, we need to think more about how personalised support plans could actually think to deliver kind of physical health support for people living with dementia. So moving on to the next slide, what is the research that supports kind of the value of physical activity? Well, certainly there's the Notts County football research. So that was providing some weekly sport for men living with young onset dementia. Again, it had all the kind of benefits of not being in kind of hospital type settings or clinic settings. This was out in the community, up at the football ground. And, you know, that actually is very enticing to people, rather than, you know, you've got to go and have your physio somewhere. Actually going to play football is seen as a lot more enjoyable. And in fact, that's what the study showed, that people had enhanced enjoyment. And they felt really positive about, and, you know, being part of a group, it was the thing that they looked forward to each week. And as I've mentioned, it was a dementia-free environment. And then there's the organisation Sport for Confidence, which looked at offering people living with young onset dementia. They actually had a sports coach and were offered a range of different sporting activities. So it could have been swimming, if that was someone's preference, bocce, playing hockey more in a group. And not only did people have, as you might expect, increased fitness and flexibility, but it seemed to have some positive benefits also on cognition and certainly self-esteem. So if we go to our next slide, and this is just to talk about our experience with the Younger People with Dementia charity. So we offer a range of different groups. We actually did our own research looking at the benefits of gardening. And this was people attending for 2 hours for a very structured gardening session. And the format was the same for each week. We ran this over a year, and people arrived. They had a kind of, you know, it's always the cup of tea, but a planning session. You know, what should we do this gardening session? And then people were kind of physically active for a couple of hours. And we looked at various measures. It was back in 2013, so we were using the MMSE back in clinic. So we had the kind of 6 monthly MMSE ratings that we could look at. But we also looked at kind of the pool activity, the PALs, kind of monitored people that way cognitively, and also looked at the Bradford Wellbeing Profile. So this was filled out once a week when people attended. And what the structured gardening programme showed is that people had enhanced self-identity. So it wasn't just about going to do the physical exercise, but there was, I've got my gardening group. It was purposeful because they planned at the beginning of each session and could see the fruits of their labour throughout the whole year. And it was this sense of feeling useful. And, you know, just thinking of the earlier research that was presented, this was kind of unexpected, because some people that attended were kind of further on in terms of the length of time that they had their diagnosis, but feeling useful was still quite an important point, not just the activity for them. Moving on to the next slide. So just thinking about how we can adapt any physical activity for younger people. It's about having things that are, you know, chosen by people. Although having said that, we have run like table tennis, and we had a relative bring his wife along to the group. He said, well, she's never done table tennis, but let's see. And actually, she was brilliant and learned a new skill. Within the charity, we run a whole range of different activity groups. So, and again, thinking about risk positive approaches, canoeing out on the River Thames in the warmer months. And that's where people of all abilities, all diagnoses, can get in a canoe, paddle along the river. And again, we just see such a positive effect on their mood and sense of belonging. We also run various things, cycling, walking groups, running, badminton, you name it. And people have a choice. So they say, can we do this next time? And moving on to the next slide, the benefits that we've observed, which always seems kind of a bit obvious, really. If you're physically challenged throughout the day, then people tend to sleep better. And family supporters will often say, "Oh, we love Tuesdays when," because my husband always sleeps so well after cycling around a velodrome for an hour. There's also a sense of community, and through exercise, you're not only part of a team, but it can have a competitive element. We also are aware that it has quite a calming effect. So attendees, when they've been out on the canoe, it's quite peaceful going along the river. And as I've said, it accommodates a range of abilities and diagnoses. So next slide, and I'll be very quick, aware of time. So when we were thinking about this talk, we were trying to think of, giving you examples of things that might be quite easy to deliver within services, because it's very easy for me to say, yes, we set up a charity and look what we do 5 days a week. But are there things that could be readily adapted within kind of clinics or things that maybe day centres are doing already, or kind of groups that you could just adapt? So we looked at the evidence for reading, and as a clinician, it's often the thing that one of the questions, do you still read? And people living with a diagnosis of dementia will say, or their family supporters will say, well, actually, my wife used to love reading, but she's stopped now because it's really difficult for her to follow the book. So we've kind of looked at ways to adapt that, and the Get Into Reading group, the reader charity in Liverpool, have done some research, and they looked at facilitated reading in a care home, in an inpatient setting, and in a day centre. And through shared reading, found that there was a decrease in people's behavioural and psychological distress, an improvement in mood, and anxiety and concentration levels. People's verbal communication seemed to improve after this 18-week of regular reading once a week. And when they did a follow-up study, it actually showed that there was an improvement in quality of life scores. So it seemed to be quite a good thing to think about. Could we adapt this? Because this looked at people in kind of care homes particularly. Could we adapt this within the charity? And if we go on to the next slide, this is sort of how we've done it. Basically, we've had, we don't run these groups all the time, but kind of at requests or in the winter months, it's quite nice to sit around in a group and read. And generally, we have groups of 6 to 8 people. It may be people living with dementia. We've sometimes run a parallel group for family supporters, or we've run them both together. But generally, the setup is that we will choose a chapter or a short story and a poem, and we will read aloud. No one has to read, and we set that out at the beginning, but often they do, and certainly by the end of the 6-week period, everyone will have had a go at reading. And the facilitators will read aloud. We make mistakes because it's okay to make mistakes, and that way we can increase people's confidence. And what we'll do is read a few sentences or a short paragraph and then reflect on it. So it's not about what's just happened. It will be more about, oh, I wonder what era this is set in. I wonder how old the chap is. And through this, everyone has, it invites opinion, and everyone gets talking about it. And through chunking and discussion, people are able to read, you know, whole chapters and retain the information at the end. So it's very interactive. We've had, again, people with all sorts of diagnoses sign up for the reader groups. We can adapt how it's presented. So for some people and people with posterior cortical atrophy, sometimes it's about reading it in kind of almost newspaper style. So we'll change that, or bigger font. And often it will evoke other memories, and people will come up with kind of, it becomes a reminiscence group as well. So just moving on to the next slide. These have been our observations, and it's sort of is parallel with what the reader group research showed. People's mood and confidence seems to improve, their verbal communication, and some people who are, I can think of many anecdotal examples of people that have struggled with their verbal communication, who by the end of it will read whole sentences. It prompts reminiscence, which is really powerful for kind of mood and self-esteem. And it's very relaxing. I love being read to, and we have a lot of fun with these. So if we just go on to the next slide, this is the kind of, we just tried to this is your summary, almost your summary. I'm going to hand over to Jan for the last slide. But these are the sorts of things that are kind of characteristic of what is helpful, really, and why activity is important. I won't read them all out, but you could just read those. But for me, I think it's about a risk positive approach that's really important. So if we move on to the next slide, and I'll hand back to Jan.
So overall, we thought our summary of what we've wanted to say today is that meaningful activity is especially important for people with young onset dementia who are at a time of life where purposeful and enjoyable activity is really important. And activity does emerge as important in qualitative studies, but we need more evidence if we're going to persuade those who commission services to place emphasis on this area. In the Angela project, we found that that people had 3 key needs, and helpful services tended to meet one of those 3 key needs: to maintain a sense of who you are, to maintain your connections with others, and to maintain control over your own life. And meaningful activity hits the mark for those needs, which may be one of the reasons why it seems to be so fulfilling and be so helpful to people. And we've seen from the examples there are all sorts of meaningful activity, from those that are quiet and peaceful through to those that are team sports and competitive. So choice and tailoring are essential. Before we finish, we've got 2 short plugs. The next slide shows the book, which will be coming out early next year, I think is the latest date for it. And we'll have the chapter in this book. And if you could skip on 2 slides, please. We've presented today really on behalf of Young Dementia Network. Many people here may belong to Young Dementia Network, but if you don't, you can join for free, and you can see the address there on the slide. Young Dementia Network is a network across the UK with something like 5,000 people, and it includes both health and social care and third sector professionals of different sorts. It includes people living with dementia, family members, and academics, and our whole purpose is to try and improve the lives of people living with young onset dementia and their families. And you can find all sorts of information and resources on the website, and you can join in as actively as you like. So going back one, just to say that hopefully we've left some time for discussion, and we'd be interested to hear your experiences and what you think about activities. Thank you very much.
Jan and Jacqui, thank you so much. That was incredibly interesting. Really enjoyed it. I love the subject of activity. Those interventions we can give people that support quality of life, where we just don't have a lot of pharmacological options, do we? And actually, they can make such a difference. And why would we stop doing the things we love when we have dementia? Surely the starting point needs to be we modify, we change to fit the individual. There's so much I could pick up on before I go to the questions. I love the way you talked about people's busy lives, 40s, 50s, 60s, right at the beginning. I'm bang smack in the middle of a very busy life with small people and work and everything. So I totally get that. And you're right that actually that idea that someone, you know, they're more physically healthy and they would lose that the purpose in life and the actual ability to do stuff. I think you really captured the essence of why this is a particularly acute issue for younger people who really are potentially in that really massively busy time in life. And then I loved how you talked about the 3 examples you gave. You're absolutely right, they are replicable, and that's so important for our audience today. So thank you. To try and do something around singing, physical exercise, and reading, I think is just absolutely fantastic. And I love the risk positive approach that you had as well. I would say that in terms of music and singing, we have Playlists for Life are going to be our next guest on a webinar. So I'll be promoting that at the end. Physical exercise, I always feel better when I've done something like that. So we do need to promote that a lot more, and reading as well. I know we've talked about cognitive books, the new books that have come out. We've written about those on Dementia Community News, but just to be able to facilitate people to enjoy stuff like that is so important. Right, that is enough rabbiting on from me, because I'm sure our audience have got lots they would like to pick up on as well. And we've got about 9 minutes. Let me have a look in the chat. So Leslie says we run equine therapy sessions and you can see the delight in the participants. I absolutely love that, Leslie. Thank you so much for sharing that. I can imagine that would be wonderful. Animals, we always talk about animal therapy so much, don't we? Dogs, cats, snakes in care homes. No, not snakes. No. But yeah, I totally, I think equine therapy sounds lovely. I've seen examples of people bringing horses and donkeys and things to hospitals and care homes and things. So that's amazing. Right, does anybody have any questions for Jan and Jacqui? It's your opportunity. I can see some fabulous people have joined us today. Some names I'm recognising. We've got a couple of Admiral nurses with us. Quite a few experts around young onset. Does anybody have a question? You can come off mute if you'd like to. I'll pop it in the chat.
Hearing Jacqui talk about the activities and then thinking about equine therapy, it does make you feel how life could be enriched by an opportunity for any of us to do some of these things. I quite fancy an experience of kata canoeing.
Absolutely, yes. And the way you said it was so peaceful to be on the water, and I think that feeling of people can be calm, and it's not an in-your-face challenge, is it? It's just something that's very gentle, and you can adapt to it yourself. I think that's just wonderful. I was having a bit of a private chat with somebody who's on the call today who is an OT. Not to put you on the spot, if you want to come off mute, you're very welcome to. But she was just saying it's so fabulous to see people advocating for these kind of OT type interventions that OTs champion so much. And that's just so incredibly important. I can't wait for your book, early 2025. Is that a
Very
Jessica
exciting.
Green or who's publishing that for you?
It's in the series called Reconsidering Dementia, or have I got that right? And it's a series that's overall edited by Dawn Brooker and Keith Oliver. And it began with a book which marked the 20th anniversary of Tom Kitwood's seminal publication. And several books have come out in the series already since. I'll just look on the, can I look on the internet while I'm on here? If I can, I'll put the link in the chat because there's a page that shows all the titles.
Oh, fabulous. Thank you. So we've got Jane Ward says the equine therapy sessions are part of a wider project, which also includes gardening, accessibility cycling and walking, We are also building on work for people with young onset dementia. That's amazing to hear, Jen. I think you're doing a lot of stuff down in Hampshire, aren't you? So that's fabulous to hear that. And I would say actually on our Dementia Community YouTube page, you can see, so earlier this year we had webinars both from Thrive, the Gardening for Health charity, and also Dementia Adventure alongside Debbie Carroll. They talked a lot about sort of risk positive and how we can work with risk rather than seeing it as a barrier. Tessa Gutteridge, maybe, I don't know. Thank you for this webinar. Good to hear about activities that bring pleasure. Joy is saying thank you so much for this session. Jules, hello. You are an expert in this area. Some families that I work with really struggle financially, and therefore finding funds for activities and engagement can be a real challenge. Any suggestions? That's a really good question. Jan or Jacqui?
I mean, I think it is really, really difficult. I mean, we've done it through the charity, so it's free. So any of the activities are free for people to attend, which I feel kind of passionately about. We know from kind of the whole what happened to day centres when they were free at source, people went. Even when people have the means to pay, they don't always see the rationale for, you know, for family supporters, for, you know, the importance of respite in a timely way. So you know, actually having something that is, you know, and if you look at the studies, you know, what makes people attend, it's accessibility, and, you know, cost becomes part of that accessibility. It's going to, you know, we just rely on grants, we get funding from the ICBs, and it's about banging the drum, and it's about providing an evidence base for why this is so important. Yeah.
And you included some fabulous evidence examples within your presentation. And I think one of the things I would give an impassioned plea for, and I think Jules is due to do a webinar for the Memory Services National Accreditation Programme. Jacqui, you'll know about that. Your memory service is part of that. I'm a peer reviewer for that. And I think hearing about this activity-based approach that you're talking about and trying to hopefully get some of this embedded into that post-diagnostic support that that memory clinics offer would just be amazing to see. I know many just people with young onset are often funneled in different directions and they're not part of that sort of mainstream offering, but that would be amazing. Thank you. Jane says our memory choirs, if I could speak properly, spread across Hampshire, also gig across the county. Amazing. I love a good choir. I've got very fond memories of choir as a child. This session has been really helpful and interesting, so thank you, Angelo. Jan, thank you very much for that link. That'll be the link to the book series.
Yes.
Yeah, amazing, thank you. Kaylee says, no question, but just to say thank you for this presentation, very insightful. Lots of benefits to be gained from these activities, especially physical activity, real benefits for mental and physical health alongside the social benefits. And I think we'd all entirely agree with that, wouldn't we? It's just great all round. You just feel so much better. Kate, thank you very much. You've popped a link in there for us as well. Hannah, another one of our experts on the call today, highlights activities for children can be involved with to connect with relative with young onset dementia, which I think is so important. I just saw the most beautiful thing earlier, and I've got no idea if the gentleman had dementia and they had their backs to me. But I was in a local village and walking along the high street was, I imagine, a grandson arm in arm with his granddad with his walking stick. But it was just the most beautiful thing to see. And I think where we can connect the generations is just wonderful. Suzanne, thank you for the session. Always lots of benefits to be gained from group activities, whether physical activity or mental activity. It's good to hear activities being offered to young onset group across the UK. And I mean, you do just amazing stuff in Berkshire, Jacqui. I know I've been lucky enough to sort of see some of this. I just wish you guys were national. I know the Young Dementia Network is, but I wish you guys were because you're fabulous. What else have I got? Jules, thank you. Sorry, I have my screen turned. Oh, it's fine. Don't worry. Lots of background noise. Another thank you. Thank you, Codbury House. Charlotte, thank you. As an OT, it is wonderful to be amongst like-minded people. There are huge benefits to meaningful and purposeful occupations. Embracing risk is so important. It's hard to spread the word about the value of our profession, but I believe it is so important for these people who we support. I think we'd all agree with that, wouldn't we?
Yeah, and very often where there is research, it's often occupational therapists who are at the heart of it. So I'd agree with Charlotte about that. You know, when you need the expertise to know what activity might be helpful in some particular way, it's often OTs who are the people who know how to find that out.
Yeah. Do you have OTs in your service or within your charity, Jacqui?
So, so our charity is all, inverted commas, non-qualified personnel. But we set up the choir, which was kind of the catalyst in a way, that was set up with my OT in my memory clinic coming along saying, look, let's try and do this. We then seconded her from the NHS 1 day a week, and then she quit her job in the NHS to work for the charity in a non-qualified role because she said she was actually doing OT work.
Oh, isn't that a lovely way to finish?
Yeah.
I love that. That's really amazing. Ladies, we have run out of time. I could keep you on a lot longer. I'm sure there's going to be loads and loads more thank yous that are going to pop into the chat. People are saying thank you, brilliant session, much appreciated. Lots and lots more I could read out. I won't leave you to read those for yourselves, but just to say a huge thank you. It's been a fabulous session, and we really appreciate your time and coming along to speak with us today. I should just signpost you all, if you are regular to our webinars, we are having a little break over the summer, but we will be back in September. Our first session in September is going to be on Monday, the 23rd of September, 2 till 3 p.m. and our guests, our presenters, will be Playlist for Life. We don't have the ticketing page set up yet. We're just finalising the details, but Beth has very kindly put a link in the chat there to our webinars page where you can keep an eye on. As soon as that ticket link goes live, grab your ticket for what promises to be a fabulous session, kind of linking with that music theme, which I think is really positive. So thank you all very much for joining us today, and thank you again to our fabulous presenters, Jan and Jacqui. Thank you.
Thank you.